Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Those words are from Psalm 19, which Nisha read earlier. In a moment, I want to talk about what they mean to me and what they can mean for all of us. But first, one day, when I was growing up, I had just come home from school. I think I was in the second grade at the time. My mom was at home, and I was rummaging around in the kitchen pantry looking for a snack. I could not find the peanut butter crackers I was searching for, so in frustration, I said something out loud, a word that I had just learned that very day at school. Not from a teacher, but from a friend out on the playground. He had said this word when we were playing baseball, and he swung at a pitch and missed. He was sorely disappointed, and out came this word. So it appeared to me that it was a word spoken when you're frustrated, or you're disappointed, or perhaps angry about something. And no, I am not going to tell you what that word was. I will leave that to your imagination. So when I spoke that word in the kitchen pantry, the next thing I knew, my mom was yanking me out of the pantry very forcefully, and with a look of complete shock and disgust on her face, she demanded to know where I had heard that word. I said, at school, which was true. She said, that's a very bad word. Who did you hear that from? I didn't want my friend to get into trouble because I knew that if I ratted on him, the next thing that would happen would be my mom on the phone calling his mom, and then he would be in hot water, and the next day we might not be friends anymore. Or he could beat me up. You know, snitches get stitches. I couldn't lie to my own mom, but with any luck, I could say just enough to blame someone else without actually naming them. So I said, it was just some kid playing baseball, which was technically true. And she said, well, I am ashamed that word came out of your mouth. It is unacceptable. And if I ever hear you say it again, you know what will happen. And I did know what would happen because it had happened before a few times when I very innocently spoke a word that was on the naughty word list. I would have to wash my mouth out with soap, ivory soap. Parents were still doing that in those days. My mom was old school. And to this day, that is why I cannot stand the taste of cilantro. To me, cilantro tastes exactly like ivory soap. But on the plus side, cilantro is a reminder of all the things I should never say, unacceptable things. I guess we all learn lessons like that, although I hope yours did not involve ivory soap. We learn what to say and what not to say to get along in polite society. We learn the importance of words themselves, that well, some words can be healing and other words can cut like a knife. Some words are hopeful and others are fearful. Some words are rooted in hate and others are grounded in love. Our words matter. One day I was walking through a park and I came across a mother talking to her young son. I had no idea what had just happened before I came along, but as I passed by, I heard her say to him, how could you be so stupid? You just ruined everything. And it took all I had not to turn around and say to this mother, really? You just said that to your own son? That was so unacceptable. Well, it was none of my business, so I moved on, but I felt so sorry for that child. I said a silent prayer that he didn't have to endure that kind of verbal abuse on any regular basis. But even that one occasion made me shiver, imagining the damage that she had inflicted. There's no way those words did not hurt deeply. Maybe he had done something really dumb, but don't we all make mistakes? And what was going on with her anyway that would ever compel her to say such a hurtful thing? But then I know that plenty of things have jumped out of my own mouth I wish I could have swallowed right back, and it's usually been to the people I care about most. It's embarrassing and shameful when that's happened, and no amount of ivory soap could clean up the mess I made. All you can do is offer more words that feel inadequate. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, but you know that the person those words were spoken to still feels the sting for a very long time. We can forget the nice things said to us, but we remember forever the painful things. So, as I've gotten older, a little bit, and I hope wiser, my appreciation for the power of words has really grown. It's important for all of us, I think, to appreciate that in the social climate we live in these days, words can inflame and escalate passions so easily. It's something I've noticed about social media, and one of the reasons I try to avoid it, is that the filters we normally place on ourselves in face to face conversations can fall away in online discussions. Sadly, it's not unusual to come across a post someone's made filled with hateful, accusatory, and vile words written in anger. Words that I can't imagine they'd say to the same person if they were sitting across a table from each other face to face at a coffee shop. But we've seen personal exchanges too, usually by groups of people who have chosen not to seek to understand or listen to each other, but to see the other side as a mortal enemy, only worthy of their scorn. So that makes me wonder about the words we speak. Each of us, how are we using them not to create division, but to build unity, not to widen any chasm that might exist, but to build bridges, not to let loose with pent up fear and anger, but to demonstrate the willingness to understand and have hope that we can work together? How can we use acceptable words? And what are acceptable words anyway? I grew up attending a church kind of like Salem, and I went every Sunday. My dad was the minister, and there was a time during every worship service, and we still do this today, that was called the sermon or the message. It's this thing that I'm doing right now. The minister's thoughts, maybe interpreting the meaning of a certain passage of scripture or a particular topic. The message is an interesting thing because it usually involves a process of study and prayer and creative writing. Hopefully, it's creative. Hopefully, people aren't bored by it. And hopefully, there's something the minister says that's relevant and meaningful and that might inspire people to think about their faith and even compel them to act on it. Anyway, every time my dad gave a sermon, he would start with a short prayer. It was always the same thing without fail. He would say, Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of every heart here be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. And then he'd preach. Well, one day I was hanging out with my dad as he happened to be typing up his sermon for that Sunday. I stood behind him and leaned against the back of his chair and rested my chin on his shoulder because he didn't mind that, and I liked the smell of his aftershave. And I started reading over his shoulder, and I noticed something was missing on the page. I said, Hey, Dad, you forgot that part at the beginning about the words of your mouth and the meditations of our hearts being acceptable and all that. He said, Oh, that's a prayer, and I just say it by heart. I said, Well, why do you always say the same thing? And he said, Because it reminds me that even though I try my best to always say and do the right thing, sometimes I might not. So when I say that prayer, I'm hoping that what I say next is acceptable. It helps to bring God into it. And I thought, even at that age, that that was a remarkable admission to make because I thought my dad could do no wrong. It was hard for me to conceive that he would ever say anything unacceptable, but I learned later that it wasn't unusual for some member of his church to let him know after his sermon that he had said something that they thought was unacceptable. He was serving a church in Texas during the civil rights movement and had said nice things in a sermon once about Martin Luther King Jr. and was told by members afterward that talking about civil rights was unacceptable. They didn't want to be bothered on Sundays with what was happening in the world. It made them really, really uncomfortable. In the early 70s, at another church, my dad hired a female minister to be an associate pastor, and he spoke in a sermon about women's equality. So later he was told by members that that was unacceptable. It was not appropriate, they believed, for women to be ministers. A few years later, my dad invited a group of residents from a group home for people with intellectual disabilities to attend our church. They did, and they came every Sunday and sat right on the front row. And he spoke in a sermon about welcoming and accepting and loving all of God's people. So he was told by members that that was unacceptable, that those people from that home made other members feel uncomfortable. They were a distraction, those members said. So it turns out unacceptable for some people is simply another way of saying this makes me uncomfortable. You're messing with my beliefs, with my comfort zone, which of course was the very thing that always got Jesus into trouble. It's worth remembering that the person that we base our entire faith on, the one whose birth we celebrate as this hopeful, joyful thing at Christmas, and whose transcendence over death we proclaim every Easter, and who sat with his disciples and shared a sacred meal that we recreate every time we share communion, he was someone who said unacceptable, uncomfortable things all the time. It is what our faith is built on. Things like welcoming the stranger, forgiving and loving your enemy, questioning authority, bringing healing and hope to people who'd been forgotten and dealt with unjustly. In his time, those things were unacceptable. It's worth remembering that we built an entire religion around that. So, deciding what's acceptable to say and do and what's not might sound confusing sometimes. I believe in the person who wrote the Psalms gets it right, I think, when she writes these key words. May these words be acceptable in your sight, O God. In other words, don't let me get my words wrong by relying completely on my own intellect and emotions. May these words be acceptable to you, even if they're not always acceptable to someone else. And that means we have to ask ourselves prayerfully before we open our mouths to speak, what words would be acceptable to God? I think the record shows over and over again in the Bible and in our daily conversations what's acceptable. It's words that heal, words that bring hope, words that forgive and seek forgiveness, words that are patient and kind, words that try to know and understand before being known and understood, words that encourage, and words of courage, words that challenge assumptions, words of faith, words of peace, words of joy, words of thanksgiving, words of truth and light and love. I think my dad said it pretty well. You've got to bring God into it. And when we invite God into our words, what we speak will, with God's help, always be acceptable.